What we're going to analyze as we mourn this Tisha B'Av, the most challenging and the most difficult of all days on our calendar, is not the story of the 6 million, not the story of the Korbanos that we know, that we mourn each and every day, but it's a story of the 7th, of the 8th, of the 9th million, those that survived but never survived. And before we talk about our world, whether we are descendants of survivors, children or grandchildren, or whether we are part of what we call the Dor Yasam, the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, the diaspora Jews in America, Australia, Europe, we're the Dor Yasam, the orphan generation. This issue that applies today was something that the Chachmei HaMasorah felt all the way back to the Churban Bayis Sheni. There's a famous Gemara in Gittin and Parak HaNizakin. There's a Medrash in the Eicha Rabbah that addresses this issue. And it's the story of the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol, what we call the 23rd Kinnah. What do we mean? Their father was butchered. He was executed in a horrific way, and we studied about him in the 21st Kinnah. He's one of the 10 martyrs that we speak about in Eila Ezkoran Yom Kippur, that we speak about on Tisha B'Av in Arzei HaLevanon. But the son and daughter, together with not thousands, but literally tens of thousands of Jews, were shipped like cattle across the Mediterranean and sold on the Roman slave market. What do we mean? What happened was this. When we go to Yerushalayim, we know there's 2 main arteries in the Ir Atika. There's a north-south artery known as, that exits at the Shar Shechem, the Damascus gate. Why Shar Shechem? Because if you follow the natural terrain of that major north-south artery, it follows what we call the modern Highway 60, that follows the crevice, the valley in the Harei Shomron, in the Matei Binyamin, those mountains. There's a natural crevice. It's the crevice that Avram took, that Yaakov took. It's the crevice that was traversed in the Bayis Rishon and the Bayis Sheni. And from there you go to Mesopotamia, because at Shechem you veer at about a 135-degree angle and it goes into Mesopotamia. And then there's another major artery. It's called the east-west artery. That exits at Shar Yafo. Why is it called the Jaffa Gate? Because if you follow the natural terrain, which today Highway 1 is built upon, it takes you to the Mediterranean. Well, these Jews, who were not killed, who were not slaughtered, they were abducted. They were shackled and chained by the Romans. They were taken out Shar Yafo to the Jaffa port. Today, the Jaffa port, you can barely put a small fishing boat in. But you have to understand, in antiquities, it was a huge deep sea port. Just to give you an example, today in Haifa or Ashdod, those are deep sea ports. In fact, the very first Israel bond project that David Ben-Gurion raised money, he came to America to get people to buy Israel bonds, was to have a dredging project, to dredge the Haifa port so that Israel would be able to have export and import. They knew that through their Arab neighbors, there's no way that they could have goods taken through land. It would be blocked. But the seaport at Haifa was at creation. If it weren't for the meteorological patterns and the weather patterns of how naturally sand just drops when it hits land, dust, it drops when it hits land. If we could go back to the time of Yonah from Tanakh, or we could go back to the time of the Romans, we'd know that the Jaffa port was a huge deep sea port. And the Romans had ships lined up, and they took literally hundreds of captives, of Jewish captains, Shvi Yerushalayim, the captives of Jerusalem, and they took them and they sold them on the Roman slave market. And you have to understand, we know the first basic principle of economics is the supply and demand curve. You want to know what's the price of something? You match up supply and demand, and where they hit, where they intersect, that point is the price. And based upon the first lesson we learn in microeconomics, if you have a huge increase in supply with the same demand, what's going to happen? The price will go down, the price will drop. That's literally what happened as thousands of Shvi Yerushalayim, of Jewish captives, flooded the Roman slave market. And by the way, a mitzvah that we talk about today thank God we don't talk about too often. The last time was with Gilad Shalit. But a mitzvah that today is something we learn and discuss in theory was very practical at that time. For the 10, 15 years after the Churban, you know what the refugees did? The survivors, they bought each other up and then emancipated each other. As they were able to earn enough income, they would buy up a cousin, buy up an uncle, an aunt, and then free them and emancipate them. And then in turn, they would do the same. Because there was a huge, huge population of Jews, of refugees, who literally were slaves to their Roman captors. What happened here? This son and daughter, who was he? Who was she? He probably would have been the next Kohen Gadol. He was a huge Talmid Chacham, was a fine, decent young man. Who was she? She was a great woman, a great young woman, a balas midos, a tzanua, someone who was modest, humble, someone who probably would have nurtured a role model to fellow Jewish women, someone who would have nurtured, who knows, the next Nasi of the Sanhedrin, who would have raised and nurtured, who knows, a future Kohen Gadol. But they were taken. They were taken in their late adolescence, along with so many others, and they were sold the way you have, if you've been to a cattle auction, they were treated like animals. And what happened? It turned out, unbeknownst to each other, that two members of the Roman aristocracy, they got the mitzvah of their life. And they're sitting there drinking one evening, and they're describing, you know what I got, the mitzvah I found off of the captives of Jerusalem? This outstanding young man who radiates like the sun at high noon. Strong. Can you imagine the deal I got? And the other fellow says, yeah, I got a beautiful young woman. I mean, elegant, gorgeous, beautiful. Hey, I have an idea. Let's breed the two of them the way we would talk about animals, about horses or cattle. Let's breed the two of them and we'll split up the offspring. So not only do we get their use in terms of their labor value, but you know what? Their offspring, coming from him and coming from her, you know what they'll produce? They'll produce huge, huge bonus, huge revenues. What happened? They put the two of them in a room together. And keep in mind, you know, at night in antiquities, unless you're going to light candles, there is no light, there's no electricity. And the two of them each sat in opposite corners, having no clue that it was brother and sister. Nor did the slave owners, the Roman masters, know that they had bought a brother and sister. And they bemoaned their fate. What will become of me? She says to herself, I'm going to be bred to a slave. My whole life I prepared, to raise a family, to marry a Talmid Chacham, to produce the future of the Jewish people. And look at this. This is what's befallen me. And he says to himself the same thing. And they literally sit in opposite quarters instead of engaging each other. And then, as the dawn arises, as the impact of the light on the horizon, they recognize each other. They had no clue they would ever find each other. And they realize, oh my God, it's my sister. It's my brother. They embrace each other. They envelop and they embrace each other. And literally, the Kina goes on to say, the two of them, they expired. They die. They die of depression. They die of a lack of will to survive, a lack of will to go on. Because you know why? They really died when? They died in Yerushalayim, when the Mikdash was destroyed, when their father was butchered and massacred, when their friends, when their family, when their whole environment, their whole world came collapsing down. And the point of Tisha B'Av, we don't just mourn those who were martyred, those who were executed. Who else do we mourn? Who else do we consider and take into account? Those whose lives were ruined. Do you know today, and if you ask the people at the Claims Conference, we're now almost 70 years after the liberation. And you realize 1/3 1/3 of the survivors, not just in the former Soviet Union, but in America and Israel and Canada and Australia, 1/3 of the survivors are still living under the poverty level. We all champion and we all have profound gratitude to God and to the survivors who rebuilt their lives, whose families were butchered and slaughtered, who came here with nothing, who started as day laborers, who were able to rebuild their lives, build families, build our day schools, build our shuls, build our communities. And we have the most profound gratitude to them and to God at the miracle of their ability to survive and rebound. And it's true, there's no community that hasn't been built by survivors with that story. But you know something? You want to know something else? What about the survivors we don't talk about? What about the survivors who died of depression? The survivors who couldn't go a night without a nightmare? What about the survivors who couldn't function, who couldn't have a normal family life? What about the survivors who couldn't hold a job? But the survivors, whenever they'd see a policeman, they froze 50 years later. They froze because it reminded them of the trauma of the SS in their uniforms. We don't always talk about them. Those survivors we don't always speak about. But on Tisha B'Av we do. I want to share with you the story of a man who I thank God I had the honor of knowing, and whose impact on me personally I will never forget. He was a tragic, tragic story. But his story started out so beautiful. From a Hasidic family, Alexander Hasidim. You know, just in Poland itself, there were two dominant bodies. There were the Ger Hasidim and Alexander Hasidim. And Alexander's had branches, Amshanov, other branches. Just to give you an example, the agreement between, take the city of Lodz, the great industrial Polish city, where you had 40% of the population before 1939 were Jews. The Ger Hasidim, the Gur Hasidim, and Alexander Hasidim, they all agreed that the chief rabbi of Lodz would be a misnagid. Why? That way one group would not have the upper hand on the other. So he lived a charmed life. What do I mean by that? His father owned huge amounts of land in Poland, and they were in the lumber business. In fact, many times if you meet a Polish survivor with the name Kresh, Kresh is from the word keresh, boards, the krushim of the Mishkan, lumber. What did they do? Not only did they forest lumber that would be used for furniture, that would be used for all kinds of equipment, but they owned a riverbed where they would take the logs, send them down the river, and there was a mill, a lumber mill there. And they exported the lumber all over Europe. So in this family there were multiple daughters, and then finally one baby boy. And the father said that assuming the child was willing, this child would be, so to speak, his truma and his meiser. He would educate him. And this man, he was educated, and he developed, and he grew, and he was a Talmud Chacham. He had the best teachers, the best tutorers his father got him. And how he remembers sitting at Shalashudis, and Alexander Chassid, sitting in Hasidic garb with the songs, and extending the Shabbos. And his life, educationally, his life in terms of the love and the support of a family, of parents and older siblings, was a charmed life. And in 1939, everything changed. After the Wehrmacht came in September 1st, shortly after the SS came in. And his mother, his father, his teachers, his sisters, his siblings, his cousins, his whole network, they were all butchered and slaughtered. And what happened? Somehow he survived. He lived like a rat. To say that he lived like an animal for those years would be an overstatement. He lived like a rat, and he survived. And like so many others, he makes his way emaciated to a DP camp. And in that DP camp, he meets a woman, a great woman. But she's a Hungarian survivor who lost everything and everyone from her family and hometown. And he's a Polish survivor. We call it, this was one of Hitler's shidduchim. This was a shidduch that only Hitler and the SS could have made. Because in a million years, they would have never married each other. It would have never have happened. And they married. And they tried the best, like so many others, to function. And he went from job to job. And I'll tell you, he was sad. He was a tragic man. But when you could get him back to 1937, back to 1935, before the war, he became alive again. He went from being a skeleton, a pale shadow of himself. He came back to life. It was a very short period of his life. It was his childhood and his early adolescence. But you know what? That was his life. Those were the only years he lived. The only years he lived. And he could never, ever leave that world. He could never, never overcome what happened to him. And this is the story of the survivor. And no, we don't say Kaddish for them. And there's no Yom HaShoah for them. On Tisha B'Av, we tell the story of the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol. And it's fascinating. This Kinnah, the story of the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol, it wasn't written by the Kalir. It wasn't written by the Chachmei Masorah. You know when it was written? In the aftermath of the First Crusade. If you look, it comes right after Kinnah 22 and before 24 and 25. Why? Because this was the story of those few that survived mines, those few that survived spires, those few that survived Worms, Regensburg, the few German Jews that survived the butcher and slaughter of May and June 1096. And they, who were living in the communities that defined Judaism, the Masorah was rooted in mines and worms. Jews came from all over the world to study there. We know the story of Rashi. Why did Rashi leave Troyes in northern France and go first to mines and to worms? Because that's where you went for an education. That's where the Balei HaMasorah were. And it was obliterated, it was slaughtered, it was destroyed. And the few who survived, the very few who survived, they tried to rebuild and recreate German Jewry. That would take at least 100 years to rebuild and recreate. The Masorah was moved to France because that's where Rashi was. They could tell the story of the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol. The same way that the 7th and the 8th and the 9th million, they died. They didn't die physically. They didn't die physically, but they died in 1939. Their bodies escaped 1945, but they never escaped the years of 39 to 45. No, we don't say Kaddish for them, but we have to have profound gratitude and a profound sense of empathy and a profound sense of commitment to them for what they lived through and what they went through. And it's not just those survivors. How often do we know, in every one of our communities, the story of the children of survivors? Because the son and daughter of the Kohen Gadol, the Bein Ubas Rabbi Yishmael, they were survivors and they themselves were children. Children whose parents didn't make it out. And we have children whose parents did make it out. And they grew up in a home where instead of these sweet bedtime stories, they heard the stories, they grew up on the stories of how their uncles and aunts, how their older siblings were butchered and slaughtered by the Nazis, by the Ukrainians, by the Polish Catholics, the Lithuanians. And they grew up in a world where their parents, God forbid, did not want to lose them. They were born later in life, and they had 6, 7 Hebrew names. And you want to know something? If they could, the parents could have, they would have given them 60 or 70 Hebrew names, because they're not only being named after grandparents, they're not only being named after siblings, they're being named after uncles, aunts, first cousins, second cousins. Because maybe their parents were the only one of a family of tens or hundreds that survived. And you wonder why they have 6 names. And they grew up with a chip on their shoulder. I don't mean in a negative way. But that chip on the shoulder could destroy them, because they have to live. They have to live for all those who are killed. They are now responsible to make up and to move forward everything that was taken away, that was wrenched from the family, that's not simple. If you take that upon yourself, if you commit yourself to that, that's amazing, that's wonderful, that's to be lauded. But if that's imposed upon you, that's a burden that will crush a person. Emotionally and psychologically, it's a burden that will destroy someone. The story I want to conclude with, it's not a story, it's an analysis. You know, the Rav said, he quoted the Rambam from Hilchos Avel, from the laws of mourning, Hilchos Avel. The Rambam says, look, we were all born to die. The whole, biology, the metabolism of a human being, whether we live 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years, it's a blip. It's keherifying. But that's the nature of the human body. It can't last forever. And you know what? God forbid we lose a loved one. We mourn, we cry, we hurt, we tear kriya. But the Rambam says someone who extends the mourning too long, kol hamis'abel yoser midai, harei tipesh. Emotionally, that's a foolish thing. The pain, the hurt, the deprivation has to turn into feelings of gratitude and commitment to continuing the legacy. It goes from a state of acute pain and mourning to a different emotion. But the Rav said, and that's the point of the 23rd Kina, that each and every year, v'ahima miyamim yamina, v'ahima miyamim yamima, each and every year we come back and we tear kriya. Each and every year on Tisha B'Av, we're back at the funeral. We're back. Mi shemesel mutal lefanav. The dead is in front of us. They haven't been buried yet. We're having the kinos are the hespedim. Each and every year we go back into a state of horrific mourning, terrible, horrific mourning. You know why? Because this isn't minhago sha'olam. This is not the way of the world. In no way, shape, or form is this the way of the world. That someone is slaughtered, that someone is butchered, that someone dies al kiddush Hashem because they're a Jew, because they represent God, they represent the Masorah. And that this young man and young woman, the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol, this is what befell them? They were shackled and chained and sold as worse than cattle? That this young Alexander Chassid had to live like a rat? That the rest of his life could never escape what was done to him? That is not minhago sha'olam. You can never overcome that. And that's why in the Kina, the author of this Kina says, Es madai afrima, my clothes I will tear kriya and I will rend them. And I'll go back into Shiva each and every year. Because this isn't minhago sha'olam. This is not the way of the world. For someone who represented the beauty, the grace, the depth of our tradition, for someone who stood for God's values, to be butchered for that we come back each and every year. We go back and we relive the mourning. We re-experience the mourning. That's the story not only of those who were killed, but those who weren't killed. But nevertheless, spiritually, emotionally, they died. They died a million deaths because they died that death each and every day of their life, that they lived past the point, whether it was of the Shoah, of the First Crusade, or of the Churban Bayis Sheni. On Tisha B'Av, we mourn their suffering. And we try to a small degree to feel their pain. Thank you.